So I think it's still morning. Good morning. So I'm here. I'm basically going to be speaking for about 35 minutes. Essentially, we'll be going over about 6 chapters in the building code. And again, it's about use, occupancy, height, and area. Okay, use and occupancy. There's pretty much it has been the same in 2014 code as it was in the 2008 code. There are a couple of key changes. The first one is actually a very nice change in assembly spaces. As you know, in the 2008 code, if it was less than 75 people, but it was still classified as a name as an assembly space, we would have to classify it as an occupancy group B, a business. However, confusion arose then as to, well, what do I do exactly with the fixtures at that time? So we clarified that in the new code. Now you actually have a choice between using the assembly group or using the business group occupancy in order to determine the number of toilet fixtures. So as you can see in the example given, for a restaurant, rather an art gallery, which is definitely an assembly, if you classify it as B, it's 1 per 25, 2 per 50, and it could be quite excessive in terms of toilets required. However, if you go to an A, you see it's only 1 per 200. We also clarified in BC 304.1 ambulatory healthcare facilities. Again, we decided to classify this under a B, business occupancy. So these are the urgent care facilities. There's a picture of it shown here. And there are detailed requirements for such facilities in the code. Okay. Moving on to Chapter 4, use and occupancy. All right, I'm sorry, and special requirements. So we will be dealing with high-rise and other types of special buildings as well as it is now in the 2008 code. So as you know, this was all based on the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the World Trade Center report. Okay, so the recommendations, some of which were already incorporated in 2008 code, we're basically expanding on that some more, and we're going to be adding more of it into the 2014 code because a lot of it was also incorporated in 2009 IBC. All right, for high-rise buildings that are in excess of 75 feet, and just so you know, if you're worried, this doesn't apply to, I believe, air traffic control towers, if anybody's out there who's designing one. It doesn't apply to R3 occupancies, which is, one family. And sometimes we do get high-rise one families. But a lot of that was already in the 2008 code. Essentially, we're increasing the fire resistance rating for structural members. We're adding bonded strength requirements for sprayed fire-resistant materials, meaning the steel. We're actually describing it more, and we're adding higher bond strength. And there will be redundant sprinkler risers required in any of these buildings that are over 300 feet. So this, again, is an overview of what is in the code. Stairway enclosures. So in section 403.5.1, okay, there's a rule now that the stair enclosures have to be the lesser, I'm sorry to read this, but it has to be the lesser of 30 feet or 1/4 of the maximum diagonal dimension of the area served. So you see in the drawing shown, the diagonal, is measured from the extreme points, and it could be 1/4 of that, or it's 1/4 of the maximum diagonal dimension. Now again, this is measured to the stairs, so please note, it's not measured to the doorways, it's measured between the stairs. So a stair, such as a scissor stair, which is very common, only counts as one stair. Okay, essentially 0 distance on that. So this, that I believe was also in the 2008 code about the scissor stair, but the measuring not from the door has changed. Super high-rise construction. All right, again, we have a stronger construction class for the structure. It's typically 1A construction is what will be needed. Okay, again, this doesn't apply to, for additional egress capacity other than R2, and in R2 you'll still go to Chapter 10. there's either, you have choice now. You can have either an additional exit stairway, or you can have occupant evacuation elevators and wider exit stairways, or you can have all public passenger elevators serving as occupant evacuation elevators. And I'll go into that in the next slide and give you some examples. So, option one, you see, has the additional exit stairway. And by the way, the third stairway, when it's used, does not have to comply with the previous slide that I talked about. This is only required for two of the stairways. The third stairway does not have to meet this requirement. Okay, so option one is shows the 3 stairways. Option two, again, you can have wider stairways and the evacuation elevators, which are self-evacuation elevators for the tenants, or you can have all evacuation elevators and not bother with the third stair. So you have 3 choices now when you're doing a super high-rise building. And again, as James stated at the very beginning, this does not take effect until June 30th, 2015, or until there's a zoning text change, because there will be some zoning credits given for this. Fire service access elevators are going to be required in all high-rises over 120 feet high. This is a new requirement. Okay, and leaving high-rises now. Okay, sorry. Because again, Chapter 4 does deal with other things besides high-rises, but private garages. So there is a modification for a minimum 1-hour fire rating of freestanding garage walls less than 5 feet from an adjacent exterior wall. We did not have such a requirement before. We're also adding a UL requirement, 325 for garage doors openers. Okay, so basically the fire rating standard is the new requirement. Open garages. Okay, we're now getting a little bit more flexibility. There's height and area reallocation allowed in conjunction with percent openness. So what this means is if you have, I believe it's 3 sides open, you're allowed to increase it 1 story and maybe increase the, let me just check my notes here. Yes, if it's 3 sides open, you can increase the area by 25%, and you can get an additional tier. So this is one option. If it's 4 sides open, you can again go up 1 tier, but you can increase the permitted area by about 50%. So again, there's more flexibility here. And we're limiting fuel dispensing prohibited in open parking garages. That's no longer allowed. I believe there are some garages throughout the city now that have it. That will stay, but going forward, it won't be allowed. Actually, I heard in Manhattan the other day that there's like only 4 gas stations left, so maybe we'd have to look at this. But all right, correctional facilities. For those of you who are interested in this, we are expanding requirements for correctional design. Essentially, things like guard towers, you can use a ladder for egress and things of that nature. So we are expanding on that. Hazardous materials, this is essentially a reorganization of the material that we had before for hazardous materials, and we created a new table. Again, for those people who deal with industrial facilities. Storm shelters. So we do have definitions and requirements for storm shelters. Now, storm shelter is a standalone facility. You know, if you go out west, there's many storm shelters and they'll build a building and the community goes to it. In New York, that's not the case. It usually will be a school or a library, things like that. And we've added requirements to accommodate storm shelters in such facilities that they'll have to meet certain new requirements. Okay, separation of occupancy is Chapter 5. Okay, before we get into separation of occupancy, also in Chapter 5 is a requirement for freestanding address signs. So if the building is set back from the roadway in order for the EMS to get to it or the fire department to get to the building, and they want to see the numbers. Some of the borough presidents, I believe, and have passed laws requiring this as well, because it is a big problem. When the EMS truck drives by, they actually don't see which building it is, and they pass by, and they waste valuable time at that point. So this is a requirement that we put into the code requiring it. Essentially, it'll be a freestanding thing in the front. On my house, actually, I attached it to a tree because my house is somewhat set back. Mixed use and occupancy. I will be going over this in the next few slides. We'll be discussing accessory, non-accessory, separated, and incidental uses. Accessory. So for an accessory use, there is no separation required. Okay, it's individually classified per Chapter 3. So if it's an M occupancy or a B occupancy, it wouldn't be an M, but it might be a B occupancy if you have some offices. But it cannot exceed the values in Table 5.3, meaning you're limited by the tabular limits in Table 5.3 of the 2014 code. And there are no increases allowed in area or height because of your accessory occupancies. You can't take credits for it. Your particular accessory occupancy must conform to Table 503. Okay, and in terms of the code requirements for the building, again, it's the most restrictive between the tabular limits or BC Chapter 9 for fire protection. And there's other requirements for the accessory occupancy. There's a diagram on the next page which indicates that there's actually a fire barrier in here, and we're showing two 500 square foot accessory occupancies. Now, an accessory occupancy is limited to 10% of the story. So you can't have a whole story and say it's an accessory occupancy. It's limited to 10%. There are exceptions in the code, but that's the general rule, and that's the example that's shown here. So even if you look at this particular one, if you look at the 500 square foot accessory occupancy in the main occupancy group M, that actually would exceed 3,500. That would exceed 10%, but because the 500 plus 500 is 1,000, which is 10% of 10,000, this is acceptable. Non-separated occupancy. Again, obviously there's no separation requirements for fire resistance rating. These are also individually classified. Again, it's based on the most restrictive allowance for the occupancy group classification for Table 503. So whatever it is, whatever is more restrictive in the area is what you would be using. And again, per Table 503 and BC9, you would use what's applied. If there's an accessory use, you would again apply those requirements. Going to the next slide, you'll see that we have three occupancy groups shown here. It's a group B, a group F1, and a group M. So out of these three, the group F1 is the most restrictive, even though the floor area is less than that of the group B shown here. So typically the building would then have to comply with the group F1 in this particular example. Okay, and again, the accessory occupancy is acceptable because it's less than 10% of the floor area for this particular example. Separated occupancies. So we have table 508.4 for separated occupancy, and it talks about the height limits and the construction classifications of each individual occupancy. And again, these are individually classified, and they're subject to the requirements for each area. Moving to the example. Okay, you can see that between group B and group F1 occupancy here, there's a 3-hour fire barrier requirement. Where's Where'd the table? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought there was a table 508.4. It's not here. So that if you were to look on the table, you would see that between these two occupancies, there would be that separation requirement for between B and F1. And again, accessory has no separation requirements here. Okay, similarly separated occupancies. This is a vertical arrangement. I just want to step back from this example because this is taken from the IBC. This is actually, I don't believe, accurate per our building code. But the point of it is to show you that there's a maximum occupancy classification of 5B for one story. Okay, for a two-story group A3, you would have a maximum occupancy of VA, 5A. And for a four-story, you would have a 3B. I believe our building code actually limits you to 3 stories, but in the IBC, which is slightly different, it's allowed to be 4 stories. But the point of it is that you can have separated occupancies that go vertically as well. So incidental uses. An incidental use is something like what's shown in the drawing, a waste room or waste recycling room. Could be a film editing room in a business. I encountered one actually at NBC Studios. So it's a very high-risk area. These are limited to 10% of the building occupancy. It can be classified under the main occupancy, but it must be separated, obviously. Okay, and it's per table 509. So for table 509, it shows you between which occupancies. So in the first example, it says a furnace room or any piece of equipment is over 3,500 BTU, and that gets a separation of 2 hours or 1 hour separation with an automatic sprinkler system. And this goes through the table and it can explain it. Now, underlined in this particular example is mechanical and electrical rooms that are not identified in the table. Okay. Now, mechanical and electrical rooms can be classified as the occupancy for the building. So if it's an office building and you have a mechanical room, that can be classified as an office. However, you can also classify them as group F2 occupancy, okay, in accordance with the code. So it can be done either way now. Again, similarly for horizontal building separation, if you have certain occupancies in the lower levels not exceeding 1 story, and typically of 1A construction, okay, you can essentially separate that from the other buildings above it. Now, the other buildings above it, in terms of the height, must comply with their requirements above grade plane, but there can be separation, and these could be treated as separate buildings. Okay, as you can see, there's also a requirement for 2-hour exit enclosures. Everything is in there, but these are essentially separate buildings and can be treated as such. Okay, this is again another example showing you a parking facility with actually 3 buildings above it, and the parking facility has a horizontal fire-resistant separation. So it's quite a big deal. It has a 3-hour horizontal separation for these occupancies. So it isn't anything to take lightly if you're considering to go in this direction. Types of construction. Okay. BC Table 601 is the same as we've had in the 2008 code. We added new definitions for primary structural frame, which definitions are on the following slide, and secondary members. So a primary structural frame is the columns, and main load-bearing members that are in the building. And secondary is everything else, and we clarified those requirements. fire and smoke protection features, okay? We had definitions before in a 2008 code for fire barriers and fire resistance rated construction. We now essentially have fire barriers and we have horizontal assemblies. And these are gone into great detail in section 707 for fire barriers and section 712. Or you could use both, obviously, in your particular building. But we have extensive requirements for these kinds of, for these devices now. So the barriers and the horizontal assemblies have, full sections describing what is needed and the rating requirements. So buildings that are now within 10 feet of adjacent buildings are required to be fire resistance rated on both the interior and the exterior surfaces. If it's in excess of 10 feet, it really is just on the interior surface is the requirement. Now the previous requirement in 2008 code was 5 feet. And this is BC section 705.5. Portions of buildings cantilevered over adjacent buildings. The requirement now is if the horizontal cantilever exceeds 1 foot, an engineering analysis must be undergone and it must be submitted to the department for review. So we're going to be taking a look at this. So this is obviously done by a structural engineer or something equivalent to that. And we will be taking a look at this. And this is the requirement for 705.12. Again, new. Shaft enclosures. Let me just go to the next slide. So there are now fire door and shutter assemblies required. Fire doors must meet UL 1784. And there are some requirements for smoke-activated self-closing doors, which is why I skipped to this slide before the other one. So this is in lieu of self-closing doors. This is permitted and required. So an area such as, I think again a laundry chute room could have an automatic closing door. Now it's actually mandated in a room like that. If you have a laundry chute area and the door is open, it's mandated now that that particular door will close. Now it's permitted when we get into active design guidelines. So they're encouraging now exercise in the workplace. Some offices just want it. So if you have 3 interconnected stories and you don't want people using the elevator, and actually at 280 Broadway we do this as well, you can use self-closing doors to have the doors go shut. So they could be held open, but in the event of a fire, upon activation of smoke, they can now shut. And this is again new to the 2014 code. Interior finishes, we have new surface burning characteristics. In terms of UL 723, we have new requirements. Similarly, this is an alternative to ASTM E84. So ASTM E84, which was in the 2008 code, still there, but as an alternative, you can go to UL 723 to determine how things will burn, such as surfaces, rugs, things of that nature. And the last chapter that I do want to go over here is encroachments into the public right-of-way. So previously, even though we allowed marquees on several buildings for schools and offices, it's now explicitly allowed in the 2014 code. We tried to fix that up. For landmarked buildings, cornices, you do not now need DOT approval. This was a stumbling block before and would add excessive amounts of time to the requirements. We've taken it out. essentially, you can reinstall cornices on a landmark building, and it should be okay. On balconies, where there is more than 6 inches between the guards on the railing, this now counts as projected area in terms of Chapter 32, okay, in terms of encroachments. So if it's less than 6 inches, it will count as an encroachment if it's spaced according to that. So if it's more than that, it's acceptable. And finally, curb cuts. So the Department of Buildings can now direct you to remove unused curb cut. This shows a good example of one where the curb cut is going into a storefront. You know, it's not going into a driveway or a garage. We can direct you to restore it, and essentially, if it's not being used, it really has to be removed. And DOB or DOT can do this. Okay. So, without further ado, so now I want to reintroduce James. And James will be talking more about fire protection system requirements.